and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. President Trump struck a conciliatory tone on North Korea's recent actions, while his top military and security advisors confirmed North Korea's short-range missile launches violated UN Security Council resolutions. Why is President Trump's view different from his aides?
Perhaps he wants to get attention, and perhaps not. Who knows? It doesn't matter.
Let me just be clear. These were short-range missiles, and those are a violation of the UNCR.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner was CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder has authored numerous books on Korean politics and foreign policy and Asian regionalism. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Scott, President Trump said that he's not bothered by North Korea testing small weapons and that some of his people may consider this as a violation of UNSCR, whereas he thinks differently. So why do you think President Trump is downplaying North Korea's recent actions?
Well, I think that President Trump wants to keep the door open to diplomacy, but perhaps the more significant thing about President Trump's response is that it shows that President Trump sees Kim more as a foil than as a foe. And what I mean by that is that President Trump has this background in professional wrestling, and he likes the interaction between the good guy and the bad guy. And I think he loves the plot line related to the question of the future of the relationship with Kim Jong-un. Is Kim Jong-un going to be won over by his charm? What happens if Kim Jong-un gets onto Trump's bad side? All of this is more important, I think, to President Trump, unfortunately, than the potential outcome of any kind of interaction in diplomacy.
Bruce, Secretary Shanahan and Ambassador Bolton all confirmed that this is in violation of UNSCR. So some people interpret this as a disagreement within the administration. But could this be a strategy of good cop and bad cop?
I don't think it's a strategy. What we've seen the president over time on North Korea has been at odds with his National Security Advisor, the Department of State, the Pentagon, and the intelligence community. He highly prizes what he thinks is a very strong relationship with Kim Jong-un. And it's almost as if he decides, well, I've been successful in my part, now it's up to the rest of the government to achieve denuclearization. And if that's not achieved, well, that's not his fault because he's focused on the relationship. But so far, this relationship hasn't produced any of the strategic objectives the U.S. is seeking.
When asked whether Secretary Pompeo agrees with Ambassador Bolton's view or President Trump's view, the State Department spokeswoman said that all North Korean WMD are in violation of UNSCR. What she also said was that Secretary Pompeo often talks about how Chairman Kim looked straight into his eyes multiple times and promised to denuclearize. So maybe this could be the reason why Secretary Pompeo and President Trump wants to give more chances to Chairman Kim, that they see some sincerity that he really wants to denuclearize?
Well, it's really the only possible pathway to have a happy ending to this story, I think. And so I think that Trump and Pompeo are giving Kim Jong-un a chance. Because frankly, the alternative pathway is a dark path. It is one that is going to involve a lot of potential conflict and high stakes, frankly, more for North Korea's future than for that of the U.S. So if Kim Jong-un can make what we would consider to be a right choice, then that would be a great relief and actually a way forward in terms of peacefully solving the problem, because otherwise, what we're going to be faced with is the result of pressure of various types, and that is also going to be accompanied by tension, potential destabilization, and conflict.
Now, Prime Minister Abe also said that North Korea's recent missile testing was in violation of UNSCRs. The two leaders had 3-hour summit meeting. They must have had ample time to discuss this issue. So do you think the two leaders agree to disagree on this matter?
I think so. President or Prime Minister Abe, like the rest of the U.S. government, sees it as clearly a violation. And as the State Department spokesperson said, the continued existence of the missile, nuclear, and biological chemical warfare programs are a daily violation of the UN resolutions. So Prime Minister Abe is very concerned about the North Korean nuclear and missile threat. North Korea already has missiles that can hit all of Japan with nuclear warheads. But again, the president is prioritizing his relationship with Kim. He feels that Kim has promised him to denuclearize, but I wonder if the president just really doesn't realize that North Korea has a very different definition of denuclearization from what is required under the UN resolutions.
And isn't it only natural that United States and Japan have different security priorities, that they have this different sense of urgency when it comes to short-range missiles?
Well, yeah, I think that it is natural that they would have a different view on that because Japan is a lot closer. But the real problem is the disturbing statements that continue to come out of the administration related to America First and the possibility that the U.S. might just be focused on the longer-range missiles because clearly Japan is facing a near and present danger in terms of a security threat. And I actually think what's really interesting is the Japanese strategy for trying to deal with us, with Trump. Because on the one hand, Abe has probably invested more than any other leader in the personal relationship with Trump, but at the same time, he also has a stake in really investing in the opinions of his advisors as a way of trying to restrain Trump from doing anything that would endanger the alliance or endanger Japanese security interests.
And South Korean Defense Minister Chung Kyung-do, in response to Secretary Shanahan's remarks, said that official U.S. and South Korean military position regarding this matter hasn't changed at all. He didn't elaborate, but earlier on, South Korean officials has been saying that the two militaries are still assessing whether this is a missile or whether this is in breach of UNSCR. So how much more official can you get when you have the Secretary of Defense coming out and saying this?
South Korea is trying to downplay the short-range ballistic missile tests because it would undermine their efforts at inter-Korean relations, even though really Pyongyang is not talking with South Korea on any issue, even when South Korea is trying to offer humanitarian assistance. So South Korea originally called them projectiles instead of missiles, and they're still hesitating to call them ballistic missiles. But any missile launch that uses ballistic missile technology makes it a violation of UN resolutions.
Former CIA Korea Mission Chief Andrew Kim said that North Korea is just taking advantage of the lull in diplomacy to test its missiles. And also, USFK Commander General Abrams also said that he just sees this as a routine exercise. So was this only a technical testing for North Korea?
Well, it may have been a technical test. The North Koreans may have needed to see whether or not this new missile that is going to be part of their arsenal works. But of course, it has direct ramifications for USFK, for defense of South Korea. And it also doubles, I think, as a test of the United States and actually a test of President Trump and how far would the U.S. be willing to go in allowing North Korea to conduct these kinds of activities? And I think the U.S. government has provided a ceiling, but President Trump himself has not.
Well, short-range exercises or short-range activity by the North, I think is harder to discern as to whether it's a signal or not. Sometimes people see any anti-ship missile launch or any military exercises or multiple rocket launchers as a signal, and oftentimes tie it to a visit or a meeting that happened or is about to happen. But clearly a nuclear test or an ICBM test, even if it's not meant as a signal, it is certainly interpreted as a signal. I find the short-range activity more difficult to discern whether it's just military activity or whether it was meant as a signal. And if it was a signal, sometimes it gets lost in the noise.
Secretary Pompeo said that U.S. officials are looking into reports that North Korea's nuclear envoy Kim Yong-chol has been executed. There's also South Korean reporting that Kim Yong-chol, former special envoy to the White House, has been also sent to the labor camp. So North Korea purging nuclear negotiators, how does this impact the nuclear negotiations between Washington and Pyongyang?
Well, I think we have to wait and see about the veracity of those reports because right now it's just a single-sourced report. But obviously, if there is a problem in terms of Kim Jong-un's negotiating team, it's going to make it much more difficult to get working-level talks on track. But I think the really significant news is related to the opinion column by the Noam Shinmun, in which it was essentially a statement that those who are pledging loyalty to Kim Jong-un in front of him while pursuing their own aims behind his back are anti-party and anti-revolutionary. And so that, I think, suggests that maybe there are some internal issues that the leadership is trying to deal with right now, and we're going to have to watch that closely.
Mm-hmm. Wouldn't this give lesser room for the working level negotiations between North Korea and Washington?
Right, and as Scott said, we do have to sort of wait and see because we've had a lot of South Korean reporting that turns out to be false. We've had people that were reportedly executed end up returning to their jobs. And even senior level people may be sent to a re-education camp for 3 months and then they come back. So again, we need to wait a little bit. But certainly the working level talks weren't going anywhere. North Korea, as is so often in the past, refusing to talk with the U.S. and now also refusing to talk with South Korea. So progress wasn't being made. It seems Pyongyang only wants to deal with President Trump. They feel that he's an easier mark than other officials. And what it may be is that Kim was just angry that he was surprised in Hanoi. He, like many, thought Trump was going to sign what was called a small deal, and then Trump didn't. So I think that was quite embarrassing to Kim, and he may have taken it out on his subordinates.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one thing I think is really important, and that is that Kim Jong-un, in his Supreme People's Assembly speech in April, still seemed to leave the door open for some kind of talks in preparation for a third summit. And it would really have to be working level talks to prepare for that. But of course, he also was demanding that the U.S. make a concession and change its position as a prerequisite to move forward down that path.
Mm-hmm. Special Representative Biegun is attending the Shangri-La conference and meeting with nuclear envoys from Tokyo and Seoul. This is first such trilateral meeting in 3 months. Mm-hmm. Can we expect something useful coming out of this? And also, because Special Representative Biegun is not meeting with North Korean officials, is he now managing the partners and allies and trying to prod their sanctions enforcement?
Well, I think Mr. Biegun has a number of objectives. He's just trying to coordinate, particularly with our allies, on policy towards North Korea when North Korea is not coming back to the table. And oftentimes in the past, you'd have the nuclear envoys from the 5 other parties other than North Korea coordinating with each other, either trying to get things back on track or just coordinating the policy. Certainly, Mr. Biegun is also trying to enhance sanctions enforcement, and also, I think the U.S. and South Korea, or the U.S. and Japan, are very closely aligned on North Korea policy. But South Korea has, in Washington's view, been overly eager in offering benefits to North Korea. But President Moon is very constrained in what he can actually deliver because of really any economic activity with the North would be a violation of UN or U.S. Sanctions.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Gallucci said the timing of the seizure of Weiss Honest is unfortunate. So do you think this could emerge as a big stumbling block, and how can we resolve this?
And so I think the question that we really are going to have to grapple with is that when that happens, the North Koreans usually insist on the return of the assets before making progress. And so that is a risky potential pathway. With BDA, it put Chris Hill into a very uncomfortable situation of having to give back the money as part of getting North Korea back on track to try to implement the 6-party talks. And so in this case, I would say that one possible way of addressing that issue would be to consider an exchange of seized assets, because we have the Wise Honest. The North Koreans have a seized asset called the Pueblo. This is the 50th anniversary of its being taken. And I can't think of a more dramatic way that North Korea could signal that it really is changing its hostile attitude toward the United States. At the same time, it would be a big political win for President Trump to get that back.
So Bruce, the diplomacy is in a standstill, but do you see any opportunity or occasion where we could see some resumption of the talks?
Well, right now the U.S. is saying that we'd have to have some progress at the working level before we have another summit. But then again, last December, National Security Advisor Bolton said it's the very lack of progress which affirmed in the president's mind the need for a second summit. So if we get to the end of the year, President Trump may say, we haven't had any progress, I need to step in and try to have a breakthrough, or step in as a way of lowering tensions if they're building.
Mm-hmm. We'll leave our conversation here and now watch video for our next discussion.
Okay.
우선 아무 진전이 없이 북한에 억류되어 있는 자국민과 국군 포로 및 납치 피해자들의 송환 문제부터 해결하라.
South Korean human rights groups held a series of press conferences in May, calling on the South Korean government to exert efforts to bring back the 6 South Koreans detained in North Korea. Activists point out the government should at least confirm their safety and health conditions. Bruce, the last public comment I could find from the South Korean government was made May last year from the Blue House, saying that President Moon raised this issue of 6 detainees to Chairman Kim during their first inter-Korean summit, but I couldn't find ever since. So what do you make of this silence from the South Korean government on this issue?
I think it's consistent with previous South Korean policy under several administrations. South Korea has never seemed to put the same emphasis on not only this 6 detainees, but also the 500 detainees that have been, what Seoul thinks are still in North Korea, and the 500 POWs from the Korean War who are still on the South Korean government roster of missing citizens. South Korea has never really put the emphasis on demanding progress on returning those South Korean citizens, as Japan has put on the 13 or 18 abductees. So when South Korea during the six-party talks would criticize Japan for putting too much emphasis on the abductees, I tended to reverse the criticism and say, why are you putting so little emphasis on what could be 1,000 of your citizens who are perhaps still in detention in North Korea?
Mm-hmm. As Bruce just mentioned, Japan put so much effort in saving their own citizens, and the latest President Trump's meeting with the families of the abductees, that was a very strong visual message. So how stark is the difference between Seoul and Tokyo on saving their own citizens?
Well, I think it's a quite stark difference, because actually the government of Japan has prioritized the issue of the abductions, sometimes even over denuclearization, seemingly. And so I do think that has been a centerpiece for Japanese policy toward North Korea, but it hasn't really gotten the Japanese very far. At the same time, South Korea seems to have sidelined the human rights issue and actually has achieved just as meager a result in terms of human rights. And so, this really is a critical question, because it's the responsibility of the government to look after citizens. And so I think South Korean citizens have a right to expect that their government will make every effort to raise this issue with North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Bruce, why do you think North Korean government released American hostages and not South Korean hostages?
Well, the Trump administration would say it's because of the president's strength and resolve. But the return of the detainees is not unique to the Trump administration. And in fact, we had more detainees of Americans released during the Obama administration, 11 of them, whereas 4 have come home during the Trump administration. I think North Korea, sometimes they will use the American detainees as a bargaining chip, but often it's in North Korean eyes, the Americans have committed some crime, including a serious crime under North Korean law. And then, in a way, after they've served their purpose, then North Korea often wants to get rid of them, either to improve relations with the U.S. or just they're concerned that the American detainee may die in North Korean captivity.
I just want to say, I think that in the inter-Korean context, this issue is a much more difficult issue than it is for North Korea dealing with other countries. Because, as we all know, citizenship itself is a contested issue between South and North Korea. Both governments claim sovereignty over the same individuals. And so the way that the North Koreans approach this issue, even bureaucratically, it's managed through a different channel, the Compatriots Committee. There's all sorts of complications, I think, that result from that. But I just want to say that this is not an easy issue. At the same time, it's an issue that has to be addressed squarely.
And considering what happened to American college student Otto Warmbier, should we be concerned about the South Korean detainees' safety?
Certainly, and Mr. Warmbier was not the only American who was, mistreated during his captivity. And certainly anyone in North Korean captivity, you have to worry about their safety. Some Americans were treated relatively well in a guest house rather than a gulag. But it seems like with Korean Americans, they were treated more harshly than non-Korean ethnic Americans. So I think with South Koreans, you have to worry that, as Scott has pointed out, that they're treated differently than other foreigners, perhaps not treated as well.
And so, Scott, how can the South Korean government solve this issue?
It's going to be very difficult to solve, but the first step is to prioritize the issue. It should be right at the front of any discussion of humanitarian concerns. And a lot of times in the inter-Korean relationship, the focus by default goes to divided family exchange. But I would argue that this issue is actually a more serious and more pressing issue, precisely because there is no mechanism for accountability or confirmation of the human condition of the individuals who are being detained.
We'll have to leave it here and now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture of students of North Korea's Kim-Cheok University, ranked 8th at the International Collegiate Programming Contest. Students from the world's top universities compete in this annual event, writing computer programs to solve problems. Russia's Moscow State University ranked first, followed by MIT. Since 2013, North Korea's top universities won prizes 30 times at international programming competitions. Scott?
Well, there's no doubt that North Korean students may be the cream of the crop, and these are such smart people. You have to wonder what they are thinking, not about the competition, but about the chance to have an international experience, and what they might be taking back as critical thinkers from the opportunity to get out of North Korea and see how other students such as themselves are living in the world.
Bruce?
I'd have two reactions. The first is the engagement, and that anytime you have interaction between North Koreans and foreigners, whether it's in North Korea or outside, is a good thing. You try to break down the myths or the stereotypes that each side has towards the other. To be a bit more cynical, I also think that with computers and technology, whether these groups or these students will be going into the many thousands of cyber warriors, as North Korea calls them, that have made North Korea, some intelligence officials say, in the top 3 countries of the world in their cyber attack capabilities.
And some former government officials are concerned that after some missile provocations, North Korea may turn to cyber attacks. So that also raises concerns. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Snyder, Mr. Klingner, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.